are the Osmandius Project incomparable team. More information about our respective projects, as well as about all of our presenters, can be found in the exhibition hall behind us. I just want to give a couple of very quick thank yous before we get started with our opening keynote presentation. Daniel Madej has really been the person keeping all of this together and moving us all forward and coordinating everything. It's not been an easy task, and I would probably liken it to herding cats. Hadley Leesman is responsible for all of the conference graphics and the overall visual feel of the conference space, as well as the rest of all our social media posts. And Chelsea Bielek has put together all of the scheduling, both presenters and staffing, as well as keeping track of all of the ideas that we've had in the year and a half we spent preparing for this conference. The three of them together are responsible for the wonderful virtual space that we're all gathered in today. Love a good pun, as well as the myriad of other tasks that I just don't have time to mention. But it's safe to say without these three amazing people, this weekend would never have happened. So thank you very, very much to all of them. And if you see them, they're just amazing people. So thank you to them. On to our scheduled programming. Our opening keynote is Dr. Andrew Reinhard, and there really isn't a better person to give the very first presentation of this first, what we hope will be an annual conference. Dr. Reinhard is one of the founders of Archaeogaming as a discipline, and his 2018 book, Archaeogaming, An Introduction to Archaeology in and of Video Games, is foundational reading for those interested in the academic study of archaeology and video games. He's currently the Director of Publications at the American Numismatic Society and was previously Director of Publications at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. His PhD is in digital archaeology, and that's from the University of York in the UK, which, exciting note, is where my sister went to university as well. Today, he's going to be talking to us about the past, present, and future of archaeogaming. Dr. Reinhard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Hooray! All right, great. Thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen, which will be a PowerPoint slideshow. If one of you will give me a thumbs up when you see the first slide, I'd appreciate it. Okay, are we good? I can't see the screen, so someone can do audio.
Yeah, we're good.
All right, wonderful. I'll go ahead and start. Thank you. I wanted to first thank the Ozymandias Project and Digital Hammurabi for inviting me to open this conference, which is very exciting. I haven't been in Gathertown before, but boy howdy, I'm having a great time. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. Archaeogaming occupies the union of archaeology and video games, and some of the earliest video games feature archaeologist protagonists such as Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark from 1982, as do some of the best-known gaming franchises such as Lara Croft from the Tomb Raider series, for example, from 1996 to the present. And even if a person has never played a video game, they have likely encountered them frequently through other media, including print, television, film, and websites. The veil between the digital and the physical worlds becomes increasingly porous, each affecting the other in real time. And this porosity in turn affects how archaeology and archaeologists are perceived outside of the discipline. Where once real-world archaeology was viewed as elite and bookish, video game tropes have shifted towards the adventurous and the occult, such as in Uncharted and Assassin's Creed. In newer games, however, archaeological perception continues to change to one of human care of heritage and memory, with a narrative through line focused on decolonization and respect for indigenous cultures and people. For example, The Curious Expedition, Heaven's Vault, and Season, A Letter to the Future, to name a few. Another side of archaeological reception in digital games concerns the portrayal of cultures, their histories, and accuracy of their presentation. And games such as Call of Duty, as you know, that franchise, they contain highly detailed uniforms, weapons. Games in the Total War franchise, you can see here the Total Realism mod for Rome Total War. They strive for accuracy in recreating and reimagining historical battles and tactics. And you really should consult the work of Adam Chapman, who deals with video games and historical reception and representation. So give him a read, please. The Assassin's Creed franchise immerses players in vibrant, bustling recreations of Ptolemaic Egypt, Greece in the age of Pericles, or Paris during the French Revolution. And at first, The archaeological questions directed at these games concern notions of accuracy and authenticity, but in recent years they've taken a more ethical turn. Are games making caricatures of cultures? Can players destroy and loot heritage sites, and to what effect? Do in-game behaviors and treatment of cultures and antiquities bleed over into how players behave towards historical sites and artifacts? And are historical and archaeological games now the primary vehicle for communicating the past, or a version of it? Now, a third aspect of reception in games comes from archaeologists themselves. Games and game engines used to create them offer archaeologists the opportunity to create and to play with their own research questions and data, while also offering the public a way in which to engage with the archaeological record, both visually and digitally. Games such as Buried explore the relationships between an archaeologist, archaeology as a discipline, and information gathered from evidence from the past. Minecraft offers a shared space to recreate structures and sites for public outreach and interaction. Game engines such as Unity and virtual worlds such as Second Life allow archaeologists to create reconstructions of sites and structures in 3D as a way of interpreting data recovered from survey and excavation. Now, these game engines now allow creators to import 3D scanned objects and architecture via photogrammetry and LiDAR to realize accurately scaled spaces wherein archaeologists can interact. These interactions can also be facilitated through virtual and augmented reality hardware and software that creates an embodied space for human interaction with 3D visualizations of archaeologically informed reconstructions. A second major archaeogaming thread, archaeological investigation, conducts archaeological surveys, excavations, and ethnographies within digital games. And to do so, one must first allow that interactive digital media offers new landscapes that can be settled, modified, and abandoned by human players, the activities of whom leave material evidence. Games are new examples of built environments. People who play games invest actual time, money, creativity, and emotion into these spaces and make these digital habitats their own. Their activity within the digital landscape produces change, which includes the alteration of these landscapes and the creation of deposits of artifacts. The creation and use of the digital spaces also impacts the natural world through consumption of natural resources, such as rare earth metals for hardware, carbon emissions during production, and electricity during play. And this has created new economies, ecosystems, and communities, all of which ultimately leave an archaeological footprint in the physical world. Because digital games increasingly offer spaces for community and creation, especially those games designed with a multiplayer component such as World of Warcraft and Fortnite, they can be used to study human behavior even through either through direct observation or the archaeological evidence left behind. Archaeologists can adapt their more traditional tools and methodologies to digital landscapes to answer research questions about how people interact with each other in digital space, what they produce for themselves and each other when given unlimited space and resources, and whether the analyses of this observable data can be extrapolated and applied to human behavior in the natural world. It is now possible to conduct photogrammetry in newer open-world games and to create pinpoint-accurate GIS maps and data about patterns of human use and settlement of digital landscapes. These same environments also provide sandboxes to computational archaeologists in which they may conduct agent-based modeling experiments. Ethnographers can use games to observe settlement patterns and community use and reception of digital games. And because games are a relatively recent phenomenon with an ever-increasing online community presence, it is possible for the ethnographer to conduct extra game research and interviews with players who settled those spaces and later abandoned them. And multiplayer games such as EVE Online or No Man's Sky continue to be enjoyed several years after their initial deployment, and now wear a thick patina of lore and human history available as primary sources through wikis, subreddits, and even printed books. Archaeogaming's third major thread, retro gaming, works primarily with physical gaming artifacts and code, often using principles of reverse engineering to understand legacy hardware and software. The 2014 excavation of the Atari burial mound in Alamogordo, New Mexico, is one retro gaming example where archaeologists excavated digital media artifacts entangled with modern mythology, corporate decision-making, environmental impact, and evolving multiple narratives. Other retro gaming archaeologists seek to answer unresolved questions about abandoned games like Amnesia and Entombed through extracting and examining software code, often in machine or assembly language, and then resurrecting it in snippets and loops to determine how the code was written and how it performed complex computations within the confines of minimal storage space. It's experimental archaeology. Another aspect to retro gaming also involves tools and methods from archaeology's distant classical past, such as epigraphy, papyrology, and paleography. Software is authored by people and therefore contains grammar and syntax unique to individual authors. Through using epigraphic methods, merged with contemporary computational tools and languages such as Python and R, one can begin to unravel mysteries of authorship of code used in either a single game or across games produced by companies such as Atari. We can now determine how code is repurposed across games, what code was reused in later versions and variations of those games, and can identify various authors' hands. In 2023, video games have only just reached the half-century mark as cultural artifacts, and the notion of video game archaeology itself is only 20 years old, with the bulk of the published work coming in the past 10. Because archaeogaming is still a nascent archaeological subdiscipline, it continues to emerge and evolve rapidly, which can be dangerous without any kind of ethical guardrails in place. And this need was recognized early on, that archaeologists should create and follow a code of ethics when involving or investigating digital environments and their human creators and settlers. This marks an evolution in archaeological planning that considers the sensitivities of human inhabitants of digital landscapes prior to conducting any kind of research where there will be contact with human evidence or the actual players themselves during the course of archaeological work. The remainder of this lecture will review a brief history of archaeogaming's emergence in archaeological literature, touchstone examples of archaeological research in each of the three major threads, and challenges faced by the current and future digital archaeologists. So we'll start with a brief history of archaeogaming. Before video game archaeology received the archaeogaming label, several researchers were already exploring the possible uses of games in support of archaeological goals. And the very first article, Commingling Archaeology and Video Games, was published by Quinton Jones in 1997 in the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication, called Virtual Communities, Virtual Settlements, and Cyber Archaeology, a Theoretical Outline. It's possible to know how many, if any, archaeologists discovered and read this article, but based on the lack of citation in the digital archaeological literature, that number may very well be small. Now, it's not until 15 years later, apologies to Ethan Waltrall here, about 15 years later, we finally see the next published article situated at the intersection of archaeology and video games. Ethan Waltrall published the first peer-reviewed article on video games and archaeological outreach and pedagogy in 2002 in the SAA Archaeological Record. Waltrall suggested that historically themed video games could in fact be used as a way to communicate archaeology and history to a wider public, including students. And his thesis of supporting pedagogy through interactive digital entertainment would be echoed later in the foundational work by Jeremiah McCall called Gaming the Past. In 2010, Waltrall launched playthepast.org as a collaborative blogging platform for authors of various disciplines to write about the cultural heritage and games. It continues to be updated regularly. Ethnographic research evolved alongside emerging trends in archaeology, pedagogy, and games, and anthropologists, sociologists, and archaeologists recognized and observed growing communities of people within shared digital environments, ranging from virtual worlds such as Second Life to the international blockbuster World of Warcraft. Tom Bolstorff is one of the first to suggest the idea of conducting ethnography within digital games in 2006, published a book-length ethnography of his time in Second Life in 2008, and then co-authored a book on ethnographic methodology for use in virtual worlds in 2012 with Bonnie Nardi, Celia Pierce, and T.L. Taylor. Rodney Harrison published on cyber archaeology as a Second Life in 2009, one of the first archaeologists to consider conducting non-ethnographic field work within a digital space. William Bainbridge published on the social sciences and communities in World of Warcraft in 2010. Sociologists arrived within WoW on the ground floor, publishing The Rapid Life of Guilds in 2007, followed by an analysis of emergent video game cultures and human communities of online play in 2009, 2010, and beyond. And economist Ed Castronova had also recognized and began to publish on virtual in-game economies in 2003, business and culture inside online games in 2005, and the wide adoption and use of virtual worlds by players in 2007, and the use of the synthetic worlds as spaces for social science experimentation in 2009. Matt Edgeworth began to synthesize the archaeological work being done in synthetic environments in 2014. And explorations of the potential for digital games and synthetic worlds and the engines used to create them for visualizing past cultures also began to arise during the mid-2000s. Eric Champion began investigating and publishing frequently on the use of virtual reality in digital games for cultural reconstruction and interpretation beginning in 2004. His work is complemented by others researching similar avenues between cultural heritage and gaming spaces and using digital environments for evidence-based archaeological reconstruction, as a reflexive practice. Historical representation in games also began to be codified during this time as archaeologists and historians began to explore the nature of authenticity and representation. From 2002 to 2012, researchers from anthropology, archaeology, economics, history, and sociology worked largely within independent silos on cultural heritage, community, and games, forming what would become Archaeogaming's first wave. In 2013, two things happened concurrently that would begin to consolidate archaeological thinking about video games under the umbrella term Archaeogaming, launching the second wave. First, Fuel Media and Microsoft announced that they had come to an agreement with the city of Alamogordo, New Mexico, to excavate the Old City landfill to attempt to recover potentially millions of game cartridges buried there by Atari Incorporated in 1983 as part of the so-called video game crash of that same year. Second, with the encouragement of MA archaeology student Emily Johnson, whose 2013 master's dissertation at the University of York examined the cultural heritage and archaeology of Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, I launched the blog Archaeogaming.com, partner Twitter account at Archaeogaming, which has since been migrated to Mastodon, and hashtag Archaeogaming, with the intent of using these as a space for public writing about the archaeology in and of video games. The Twitter account and hashtag helped to create an online community of practice as a diverse international group of researchers began to coalesce around the ideas of archaeological reception studies, archaeological investigation, retro gaming, pedagogy, and the ethics of investigating digital spaces. Archaeologists began to discover and share the work of others, which accelerated the growth of the subdiscipline from 2013 to 2018. Archaeogaming clustered into two academic hubs. One, the Department of Archaeology at the University of York in the UK, and two, the Value Project, a collective of archaeological postgraduate students at the University of Leiden. The University of York and its Center for Digital Heritage, Archaeological Data Service, the Internet Archaeology Journal, and Digital Creativity Labs, along with Department of Archaeology's academic leadership of Professor Sarah Perry, herself a digital archaeologist invested in digitally based archaeological storytelling, Professor Colleen Morgan, an archaeologist invested in emerging digital theory and practice, and Professor James Taylor, an archaeologist fluent in the deployment and use of digital tools in the field, all contributed to a vibrant ecosystem that immersed and prepared the next generation of 21st century researchers. PhD students Tara Copplestone and L. Megan Dennis were followed a year later by myself into the department, each of us specializing in a different aspect of archaeogaming, and more broadly, digital archaeology. Copplestone's approach to archaeological reflexivity utilized digital tools and methods to understanding the practice of archaeology while confronting notions of authenticity and representation in the archaeological record and in cultural heritage. Her work regularly made use of game creation as a way of working towards a better understanding of what archaeology can do as a discipline. Dennis focused on analyzing and codifying the ethics of conducting archaeological investigation in human-occupied digital environments. My work centered around applying existing archaeological theory and methods to digital games, treating them as new types of artifacts, sites, and landscapes. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, a collective of PhD students and earlier career professionals at the University of Leiden's Department of Archaeology formed around the core of Angus A. Mall, Silla E. Aris, pardon my pronunciation of the surname, Vanda Mulebrugge, Kreen H.J. Boom, and Aris Palatopoulos. They created and hosted the first international Archaeogaming conference in 2016, the Interactive Past, which brought together what would become the second wave of scholars researching video games and synthetic worlds archaeologically. A follow-up international conference was held again in the Netherlands in 2020. Both conferences centered around the ethical considerations of game study, outreach, and pedagogy, heritage reception in digital space, and practical applications of archaeology in synthetic environments. Now known as the Value Foundation, the group continues to host online live events and ongoing projects largely focused on visualization, reconstruction, and reception in games old and new. It has also become a model for other international archaeogaming collectives, notably Brazil's ERISA, Arqueologia Interativa e Silenciosa, Electrónicas, consisting of professors and postgraduate students at the University of Brazil, Sao Paulo, and the international online collective of SASA, or the Save Ancient Studies Alliance. The publication of the Interactive Past collected volume in 2016 was followed in 2018 by my book, Archaeogaming, An Introduction to Archaeology in and of Video Games. And in it, I attempted to codify the current trends in this emerging field of research, offering a starting point for archaeologists new to digital games and synthetic worlds to understand the eponymous theory and methods. Its translation and publication for the Spanish-speaking world by digital archaeologists Daniel Garcia Razo and Jaime Alamanza of JAS Arqueologia in 2020 created a wider non-Anglo audience for archaeogaming, the diversity of which is continuing to improve. One book preceded the interactive past by a year, and Archaeogaming by 2, however, laying the foundation of computational video game archaeology. It's called Retro Game Archaeology, Exploring Old Computer Games, written by Professor John Aycock, a computer scientist at the University of Calgary. This book outlines his early attempts in understanding video games through the processes of reverse engineering, both software code and hardware. And while reception studies of heritage games lies more towards the humanities and literary criticism, Aycock's approach is firmly grounded in physical science and the scientific method. Attending the first Interactive Past conference, he learned about Archaeogaming's approach to digital media and would later partner with his humanities counterparts to publish work on resolving problems in game construction and use. Regular, and that's in quotes, archaeological conferences have begun to host Archaeogaming paid processions, the first of which being the Society of American Archaeology's annual meeting in San Francisco in 2015, followed by the Society for Historical Archaeology's annual meeting in Fort Worth, Texas in 2017, and the European Association of Archaeologists in Barcelona in 2018. 2 conferences preceded these Archaeogaming sessions and meetings, creating a prototype for what was to come. 2009 saw the first Congress on Classical Reception in Video Games, Greek and Roman Games in the Computer Age, hosted by the National University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, Norway, the proceedings of which were published in 2013. And second, the Challenge the Past, Diversify the Future conference was hosted in Gothenburg, Sweden in 2015, featuring the first preliminary talks in what would later become known as Archaeogaming. Other multi-author publications would emerge from these annual meetings and international archaeological organizations as archaeogaming became more widely acknowledged and accepted, its third wave. Colleen Morgan edited 2 special issues of the SAA Archaeological Record in 2016, focused on various aspects of conducting archaeology in synthetic worlds. Tina Rissal edited a special issue of Near Eastern Archaeology in 2021 on archaeogaming and the reception of Near Eastern, Egyptian, and Biblical archaeology. Internationally, other edited collected volumes continue to appear and largely focus on archaeological reception studies through the lens of digital games. Professor Eric Champion of Curtin University in Australia edited The Phenomenology of Real and Virtual Places in 2019. Professor Sebastian Hagenauer at the University of Cologne in Germany edited Communicating the Past in the Digital Age in 2020. Professor Christian Rollinger of the University of Trier edited Classical Antiquity and Video Games also in 2020. Professor Jane Draycott of the University of Glasgow in Scotland edited 2 volumes in 2022, with Women in Historical and Archaeological Video Games, and with Kate Cook, she edited Women in Classical Video Games. Now, outside of these collected volumes and collectives, other researchers continue to work and publish on various aspects of archaeogaming. Professor Sean Graham of Carleton University in Canada is a digital archaeologist blogging at electricarchaeology.ca and is perhaps best known for his work with games as spaces in which to conduct experiments using agent-based modeling, or ABM, as featured in his 2020 monograph, An Enchantment of Digital Archaeology, Raising the Dead with Agent-Based Models, Archaeogaming, and Artificial Intelligence. Florence Smith-Nichols is a PhD student at the EPSRC Center for Doctoral Training in Intelligent Games and Game Intelligence, or IGGI, who has conducted archaeological research in Nier Automata and Elden Ring while creating what they call generative archaeology games as an archaeologist and a programmer. Now, this literature review provides only the highlights of the fast-moving history of archaeogaming as an academic and research practice. For every publication that I've just mentioned, there are at least a dozen others written by both early career and established researchers from North and South America, the United Kingdom, and Europe. And perhaps in the next few years, those voices will be joined by others from Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Archaeogaming's 4th wave. This historiographical section has shown the evolution of a new subdiscipline of archaeology in 3 parts. And from 2002 to 2012, we see several examples of parallel thinking and preliminary publication within silo-based research in a variety of fields. From 2013 to 2019, we observed the consolidation of methodology and terminology and the emergence of community of practice, punctuated by the publication of several monographs of various aspects of archaeogaming. And beyond 2019, we encounter specialization within each of archaeogaming's 3 main branches, along with international growth, communication, collaboration, and publication. So let's talk about the present. And I wanted to give you some Archaeogaming examples. And we're going to summarize 3 of these, each one an example of a different thread of video game archaeology. We're going to start with archaeological reception. If you haven't played this game, you absolutely should. It's called Heaven's Vault, created by Ingical Studios in 2019, and it imagines archaeology as it might unfold in a fictional planetary system with a rich history and a modern archaeologist, Alia Alraza, unraveling its narrative tapestry. Alia bucks all archaeological tropes found in video games. She's a woman of color, she's thoughtful and reflexive, her only weapon being her brain and its ability to reason based on evidence. Alia is dressed appropriately for field work with head covering, long sleeves, and long sturdy trousers. Her research is tied to a university, and her supervisor does not send her out to collect artifacts for the museum. Players spend a lot of time in the library. None of the artifacts are magical. Players have the option to loot and the option to sell artifacts, but there are consequences. And over the course of the game, players visit sites, discover artifacts, talk to locals, work with colleagues, and hone skills at epigraphy, all in the service of solving one mystery while uncovering more. And not unlike modern archaeology, everything Alia says and does has consequences and affects future events and interactions. The game has an ethical core that allows players to experiment with good and bad behavior towards people, sites, and artifacts, which lead to a myriad of possible conclusions. At the heart of the game is our translation exercises as the player attempts to read and interpret hundreds of inscriptions and increasing complexity during play and reflect good and bad translation choices from previous attempts at other inscriptions. And as players make discoveries and talk to people, the archaeological timeline updates with events and new locations are revealed. And the more intense the research completed by the player, the easier it is to find places to visit. The more a player talks to people and identifies artifacts, the more robust the timeline becomes. The archaeologist's most important tool is her brain, and Heaven's Vault places critical thinking front and center. The questions she asks reflects the archaeological research questions archaeologists ask themselves when in contact with a new place, a new structure, a new artifact, a new inscription. What is this? Why is it here? Who made it? Who lives or lived here? Who wrote this and what does it say? And can the context for all these things help with interpretation both singly and in an entangled way? Dates are of secondary importance but derive from context, iconography, and materials. And there are surface finds, but there is no active excavation, although there are places in the game that have been excavated by others. There's no surveying, but there are helpful telescopes. And players quickly find that people are the most valuable resource in Heaven's Vault, just as they are during the actual archaeological fieldwork. However, on at least one moon, there's a strong anti-colonial sentiment, the indigenous population resenting the archaeologist's presence, and it's possible to make amends while learning about another culture, rich in history, art, and religion, and it is the player's choice on how to behave as a guest on another world, especially when the archaeologist's homeworld served as the oppressor for the people now visited and studied. Heaven's Vault exemplifies the contemporary trend of creating entertaining, emotionally meaningful games with a believable archaeological protagonist who realistically engages with antiquity both through past artifacts, writings, and the living descendants of the people who made them. So we'll switch gears to another example. This is Practical Archaeogaming, the No Man's Sky archaeological project. No Man's Sky, published by Hello Games in 2016, is a space exploration game set in a procedurally generated universe, meaning that algorithms create never-before-seen star systems, planets, landscapes, flora, and fauna. Human players may elect to colonize the worlds they encounter, building bases in early editions of the game, and now entire cities cooperatively constructed with other players. Major updates to the game completely changed all the landscapes and environments, which affected player settlements by burying and occasionally destroying them, mirroring catastrophic climate change events. One community of hundreds of human players affected by this change, calling themselves the Galactic Hub, took the decision to migrate to another system and restart their colony, in effect becoming climate migrants and refugees. They left behind their ruined structures as well as notes of farewell that occasionally included a forwarding address. The No Man's Sky archaeological project sought to document the Galactic Hub's abandoned settlements through survey and excavation, preserving these sites through screen and video capture, as well as through photogrammetry and georeferencing. Because the project concerned itself with a group of active human players, a set of ethical guidelines was created and put in place prior to the formal start of the project. I then worked with the Hub leadership to communicate the goals of the project and to share information with the community during the field season. The resulting data was ultimately uploaded to the Archaeological Data Service as an open access repository with each site and associated media object assigned a digital object identifier or DOI for others to review, use, and share. The outcomes of the project showed that archaeological survey and excavation could be conducted within human-occupied digital environments and underscored the necessity of working transparently with the resident community to create a shared outcome that would not only record and preserve a group's early history, but that also demonstrated how one population dealt successfully with a major disruptive event. And then the third example I wanted to show you is for retro gaming, in this case, the Atari Burial Ground. And I know there's the next session which is going to cover this in detail, but I'll give you a summary. Atari Incorporated dumped over 800,000 video game cartridges and miscellaneous hardware and peripherals into a specially dug cell in the Alamogordo City landfill over several days in September 1983. And the event and existence of the dump site quickly became the stuff of urban legend, which grew to include the theory that millions of copies of E.T., the extraterrestrial from 1982, the quote-unquote worst video game of all time, these copies were buried in secret under a slab of concrete. Well, theories continued to circulate as the internet became more widely available, even though the Alamogordo Daily News and the New York Times both ran articles, the former with photos, of the dumping, and this is being recorded in 1983, by the way, casting doubt over whether or not Atari dumped the games, what those games were, and the reasons behind their quote-unquote clandestine disposal. In 2014, Canadian entertainment group Fuel Media acquired permission to excavate the presumed site of the Atari burial as a part of a documentary film, which would be the lead entry in the series Signal to Noise, developed for the newly launched Xbox Entertainment. The production team invited me and a team of punk archaeologists to participate in the excavation, joined by video game historian Rayford Gwynns. While the excavation conducted was largely a corporate publicity stunt driven by the creation of a media product, the archaeologists were able to manage parts of the two-day salvage, working with local waste management expert Joe Lewandowski, who determined successfully where to dig, and the city of Alamogordo. Approximately 1,300 games were excavated, roughly 10% of which were E.T., the rest belonging to 40 other titles in various states of decomposition, many still in their shrink-wrapped boxes, and some grouped in shipping cartons. The results of the first excavation of video game e-waste included verifying parts of the urban legend while also myth-busting, learning what happens to video game materials when buried 10 meters deep in a desert biome, and confirming the fact that most of what was recovered was either unsold or returned merchandise, which ran counter to Atari's 1980s narrative about the dumping. The archaeologists also learned about the value and impact of nostalgia, digging for the first time in front of a live audience for hundreds of video game players, collectors, and developers, and millions of online viewers. The public archaeology and outreach aspect of the excavation cannot be understated, and the archaeologists were able to talk to observers during the dig to answer questions and to share finds as things happened. Now, the final disposition of the recovered games was split between museums and the city of Alamogordo. The archaeologists were able to reserve several representative games to send to international museums, including the Smithsonian in the United States and the Vigamus Video Game Museum in Rome, the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, among others. And the city sold most of the remainder of the games itself through a series of eBay sales to raise over $100,000, which covered the cost of excavation and paid for the refurbishment of the local Tularosa Basin Historical Museum. So the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about the future, and I see a number of archaeogaming challenges ahead of us. Most of the groundwork has already been laid to make archaeogaming a sustainable subdiscipline of archaeology, as long as digital games continue to create cultural and historical environments, and there will be a need for archaeologists to examine and critique them and to create their own games, following in the footsteps of Copplestone, Nichols, and others. At the same time, archaeologists must recognize and address 5 additional areas of growth within archaeogaming that have the potential to inform and be informed by other kinds of archaeology. And the first one is volume. In his 2021 Antiquity article, Aycock warns of the coming tsunami of digital artifacts. And I echoed this in my work with rapid archaeology of digital space, theorizing that because of the haste in which digital materials are produced, consumed, and abandoned, that archaeologists must sample from the source and the sites and the times of creation and use. So you're basically working with the material as it's being made, as opposed to standard archaeology where you're kind of going back into the past and you've got a little more time. Digital stuff, not so much. The work combines salvage and industrial archaeology in terms of rapidity and scale, and failure to document quickly examples of digital materials will potentially lose context and primary source material, leaving archaeologists with secondary sources found in Reddit, player community wikis, archived Twitch streams, and YouTube videos, as well as the Internet Archive. Now, of these, only the Internet Archive counts as an actual repository, and any digital material housed elsewhere on proprietary systems is subject to immediate loss of access and data without warning. Evidence of human occupation in synthetic environments is fugitive and fragile. Waiting to document human presence runs the risk of losing that evidence and potentially valuable insight into how people behave within spaces where they feel creative and in control. One difficulty lies in determining which games and player communities to study, determining what of the archaeological record should be preserved. And in 2023, those decisions are left up to the individual archaeologists to make, running the risk of cultural and linguistic bias, unfairly weighting Archaeogaming to Western English language games while neglecting others that are equally deserving of study. This is certainly something we need to work on. Challenge 2 is mapping. One of the most difficult parts of conducting fieldwork in synthetic environments is determining how to best record and map evidence of human use from within these spaces. Every game is different regarding the availability and functionality of tools for photography and videography, and each game presents new challenges regarding available maps and the ability to create custom maps for archaeological research, which includes creating GIS datasets and data elevation models, or DEMs. Most digital games do not use maps created by Earth-orbiting satellites, and some games use procedural generation algorithms to create never-before-seen, therefore never-before-mapped, landscapes such as No Man's Sky, Spore, and Valheim. And the challenge now is how to determine a top-level methodology for mapping and photogrammetry, which can then be adapted by researchers for individual case studies. The third challenge is agent-based modeling, or ABM. Now, archaeologists such as Isa Romanowska, Stephanie Crabtree, and Colin Wren use ABM to test evidence-based theories about human agents placed in various environments with a variety of rules that can be adjusted over the course of a series of experiments. Digital games and the engines used to create them, such as Unity or Unreal, have the potential to be used in conjunction with these ABM experiments. Future testing can be done, for example, in NetLogo by importing GIS maps of existing landscapes into it, which are control maps, followed by maps of previously unknown and procedurally generated landscapes, which I call variable maps. Many digital games contain non-player characters, or NPCs, which can conceivably be used as agents in game-based scenarios. In some cases, ABM modeling within synthetic environments has the potential to shed light on archaeological questions present in the natural world. There are two other challenges that recognize that interactive digital-built environments do not exist in a vacuum. Digital games and synthetic worlds require human labor to create and maintain, and their creation and use takes its toll on the environment and climate. So we'll talk a moment about labor. Excuse me. Major AAA games produced by massive international companies employ thousands of game developers, writers, coders, artists, animators, and designers, not to mention technical and quality assurance personnel, marketing teams, community managers, and more. For example, Rockstar Games created Red Dead Redemption 2 in 2018 with a team of over 3,000 people. The game supported, either in part or entirely, each employee and their family, not to mention the local economies in which these employees lived and worked. These blockbuster games and the companies behind them, such as Naughty Dog and The Last of Us 2, CD Projekt Red with Cyberpunk 27, they're also notorious for pushing their labor force through what is known in the industry as crunch, extreme pressure to make games playable within the final weeks of production. The hardware, software, day-to-day rubbish from engineers, not to mention the permanent temporary office spaces, all contribute to the contemporary archaeological record tied to game development. Few archaeologists have been able to tackle something so massive, which is the equivalent of studying a small temporary city and its inhabitants. And this is the modern equivalent, I think, of corporate-operated mining towns in the UK or Pennsylvania, for example, and is deserving of archaeological attention. And the fifth challenge is environment and climate. And as stated in Challenge 4, large video game companies employ city-sized populations of workers who may be attached to a project for several years or as little as a few days. Game development requires both energy and natural resources. Energy used during the creation and testing process, not to mention gameplay by end users, and hosting and maintenance by the developer. natural resources such as petroleum for plastics, rare earth metals to create the hardware and media on which the games can be played. And few specifics are known yet about how much actual energy and how large the carbon footprint created during the production cycle of a AAA game is. Some effort has been made to understand the ecological impact of gameplay. Played by millions of people concurrently since 2004, for example, World of Warcraft requires the use and constant maintenance of tens of thousands of servers located in server farms to support multiple international instances of the gaming world of Azeroth. Well, what does that mean for the current climate health? And can archaeologists recreate the record of server use and growth over time, ultimately coming up with solutions to minimize the environmental impact of a game that might one day become designated as a digital UNESCO World Heritage Site? So some conclusions. Thanks again for your patience and for listening. I know I'm going pretty fast. If archaeology is to continue to analyze human behavior and activity through the study of material remains, then it must be prepared to accept and undertake work within digital environments where such evidence is present, as well as of the physical systems that support them. For those uninitiated into digital games and gaming, it may be easy to dismiss video games as childish things. However, one need only look at the demographics of the people who play and the economies they create to see how vital a role games play in contemporary human experience. And these statistics are from Victor Yanov's 2022 article. Game revenues for 2021 topped $180 billion. Total number of estimated players worldwide, 2.5 billion. Average player age is 34 years of age. The percentage of adult players 18 and up, 70%, myself included. Percentage of daily players, 60%, again, myself. And gender, 45% of players identify as women. Now, the human-digital intersection is inescapable in 2023 and continues to accelerate. And this acceleration manifests in rapid development and publication of software, the complexity of which drives the evolution of technological change at an accelerating pace and volume inconceivable to creators and producers from antiquity. Digital games are at the vanguard of technological innovation, the history of which becomes ancient in a matter of months and buried in mere years. Has humanity changed based on its increasing dependence on rapid digital technologies? And if so, how do those changes compare with past communities and past climates? Is the speed of technology outpacing how people reflect on tradition and change? What does the material evidence tell us? Digital games give archaeologists an easy point of entry to begin to consider these larger questions. Each game is a living city hosting an active community of humans. And with older games, this intellectual property gives rise to history-rich civilizations. Most of that history, its primary sources, and its material evidence are digital, not physical, and perilously ephemeral. Archaeologists can help record, analyze, and publish at least some of that history, conducting the work close to the source, striving to make that data available as open access, open source, and sustainable for our future colleagues to discover and to use. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll have some time for questions, I think.
Hello everyone, this is Dan Mayday, one of the conference organizers to help facilitate our Q&A here. So thank you, Andrew, for that great presentation there. We actually already have 3 questions we'll have folks asking. I have one just to get us started off here because I'm personally curious. You've, of course, coined the term Archaeogaming, which is just so fascinating. And I'm a bit jealous. I come from a field called industrial organizational psychology. Not the best term. I'm curious, did you have other names for Archaeogaming that you thought or tried out before you settled on that one?
No.
You got it in one.
No, well, I was just trying to think of some kind of portmanteau, that would encapsulate something in a single word that would communicate, hopefully, what it was in a few syllables. So Archaeogaming, for better or worse, seemed to be the right thing. And, moving forward in time, for me, I was always thinking Archaeogaming was going to be like digital archaeology, digital games and stuff. And then there's a whole other swath, and I didn't even talk about this, but there are other research, plenty of other researchers researching things like board games, tabletop games, pencil and paper games. And all of this has their own history too. I focused, perhaps unfairly so, it's just where my interests lie, on the digital side, but then there's lots of other people who are doing, other kinds of archaeogaming that is not digital. And so I think one of the things that we need to see in the discipline is maybe making space for, it's not all digital all the time. And then my friend Tara Copplestone, her Twitter account was Gaming Archeo, and so I'd made the Twitter account Archaeogaming, and so it kind of developed in parallel. And that seemed to be a decent fit for a single word.
Awesome. Well, I think it's certainly worked out, and I'm glad it's part of what brought us all together here. We have two other questions already in the Q&A. We have Megan who has a question, and Laura as well. Megan, if you want to step up to the stage, and yep, you're spotlighting right now, you can ask that question.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. I was wondering how you think archaeogaming can best work towards diversifying in order to avoid the linguistic and cultural biases that you mentioned in your talk.
Yeah, when we first started out, most of the folks who are doing the research and actually publishing the research in the literature were English-speaking, English-writing authors. And thank goodness, as these ideas began to spread, we began to see, other authors publishing in Spanish, publishing in German, publishing in Dutch, and so we've seen the spread, into kind of, continental Europe, and also into South America and North America, Mexico and whatnot. There are a couple of researchers right now who are working in Japan and who are working in India. And I haven't seen their publications yet, but I know that there's stuff happening. And I happen to be on the committee for a master's defense for a South African student whose MA was dealing with an aspect of archaeogaming. And so we're beginning to see, this kind of, I don't want to say the word virus in this context, but we're seeing the spread. And the cool thing about archaeogaming, and especially because it's done primarily digitally, asynchronously, and without a central hub, is the fact that it's wide open. Anybody can participate if they want to, and we've tried to create a community of practice that is inviting, accepting, welcoming, and because it's so small and so new, we're definitely helping each other out, lifting each other up. And if we continue to do those practices, I can't help but think that we'll see this continue to spread into non-English languages, focusing on non-English games, because they absolutely are part of the archaeological record globally. Yeah, if you stand on top of me, Mark, you'll be able to broadcast to the room, I think.
Sure,
Yeah,
had to make sure my mic was on. Everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Right there. Okay, that's what I needed to do. I'm still learning the game. It's not quite in your area. I had actually a comment that I had also made to Megan is that it's kind of interesting to consider doing archaeology on things that I played with as a kid, and in at least one other case still own. But I appreciate the study, and it's just a different perspective. I'm into tabletop gaming, and I've been struggling with trying to develop a setting for, particularly for Samaria, with the observation that most tabletop games are set in kind of a romanticized medieval setting. I wanted to say, what would that be like? Are there any resources for stuff like that? The struggle I'm coming up with is how to make it distinctively that without, anyway, do you know of anything that, name lists and place lists and anything like that?
There are a couple of folks who are working on tabletop games and board games specifically, and one of whose name escapes me at the moment is working at Cambridge University, and she's a PhD candidate there and a lecturer. So if you Google things like board game archaeologist Cambridge, you'll be able to find that pretty quickly, and you can drop her a line. One of my grad school roommates actually teaches at Central Michigan University. His name is Scott DeBrestian, and he's an archaeologist who also creates tabletop games. And so, he's done some things from the Crusades that are based on archaeology and history from the Crusades, and a couple of other things. And so you might want to give him an email also, and he can kind of point you in the right direction for doing that kind of research, for archaeology, but also for, just doing historical research on games that you're trying to create. I haven't yet seen a coalescence of non-digital games folks, but if you look at various game studies publications, journals like Games and Culture, for example, you should be able to find your way to your tribe. Basically, you'll be able to find your people. In that way. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's the best that I've got right now.
Well, thank you for that answer, Andrew, there. And Mark, I know you've gone back to the seating, so I assume that your question is answered, but feel free to send us a message if you had some follow-ups there. And we have just a few more minutes left here, and I'm seeing at least one more Q&A. We probably have room for maybe one more past that if it's a short question. And Ahmed, thank you. I see you have it's hand raised there. If you have a question, you can approach the mic or add into the Q&A.
Oh,
Hello.
yeah. First of all, thank you for this, awesome lecture. I have just one question. I mean, we know, like when I read about Mesopotamian archaeology, like when you read about the letters, and it gives you, these clays, it gives you a good idea about the culture we live in. You think, with the gaming archaeology, we can get a good idea about, what kind of, the culture of the people who are playing. You think that can give some kind of a clue of, the my English is failing me today. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
I hope you're getting what I'm asking for. Yeah, because I've noticed this. Like my generation, I started gaming in the 90s, and when I see my nieces and nephews playing, it's a different kind of game, and our mentalities are different, and and so on. So you think game archaeology can also give some kind of a perspective of how people are playing in different kind of eras?
That's a fantastic question. Absolutely, you have to take that human context, that human environment of play into account, because that audience is driving the demand for the kinds of games that are getting developed, and they also give feedback, for better or worse, for the games that are published, which helps drive that economy. So by studying the games that are popular in certain regions, by certain age groups and other demographics, I do think that we can answer some of these archaeological questions about who is playing what and why and where. And then if you flip it on its head, I know the new Assassin's Creed game that'll be coming out either, I don't know if it's this year or next year, is going to be focused in the Near East. And so you'll be able to dive into the history of ancient, what is now Iraq, for example, to play as characters and to engage in those environments. And with Assassin's Creed, with the exception of Origins, which actually was in Ptolemaic Egypt anyway, those games have been pretty Western, pretty Anglo, pretty white. And so it's nice to see that change, to another part of the world, to another culture and another people. And so I'll be interested to see what happens and what the reception is from colleagues in what used to be the Fertile Crescent and what they think of it.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And then we have one last question here, which is asked by Laura, who's having some mic trouble, so I'll go ahead and vocalize that for her. She writes, you briefly mentioned the fourth wave of Archaeogaming reaching geographical areas that were not included in previous waves, and I think you kind of got at this with the recent question. Have there been any conclusions coming from those areas that have been eye-opening?
Not yet. And for example, I wish I could read Portuguese because, I've got colleagues in Brazil who are publishing, both in English and in Portuguese. But, the eye-opening thing, for me right now is the fact that, we've got folks outside the U.S., outside the U.K. and Europe who are beginning to study this seriously and to begin to publish on this, specifically with video game archaeology reception in games, and then practical archaeogaming as well. So I'm excited to see where they go. Things have kicked off in the past year or two in these different regions, so specifically in Brazil, but also, as I mentioned earlier, in India and in South Africa also. So I have Google Alerts and search Google Scholar whenever I can to see what's coming up. And I'm just delighted that people are beginning to think about this in places that are outside of where Archaeogaming got its start in the late 90s and mid 2000s. And we'll see where it goes. I wish I had a better answer to your question, but right now things are still in kind of the beginning stages. Okay. Always more data is needed. And thanks for letting me go so quickly through all that stuff. I know that was a lot to absorb, but people have the slide deck or they will, and they can watch the video playback at their leisure. Okay. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone.